Michael McCarthy sat in his spacious office, the view of Portland's quiet streets outside framed by floor-to-ceiling windows. His business was thriving, his reputation impeccable, and yet, as he stared at his reflection in the glass, a nagging emptiness lingered in the pit of his stomach. He glanced at the photograph on his desk, Michael, Tanya, and their 2 children smiling happily on a family vacation. It was the image of perfection. He had it all, a successful career, a beautiful wife, a picture-perfect family. Yet lately, there had been something unsettling in the air. He couldn't put his finger on it. Perhaps it was the endless days spent at the office, the late nights closing deals, the unspoken tension building between him and Tanya. She had always been his anchor. Tanya, with her radiant smile, had been the cornerstone of their family. But now, when Michael walked through the door at night, he felt an unfamiliar coldness in her presence. She still looked beautiful, still wore the same charming smile, but it no longer reached her eyes. He had dismissed the thought, convinced it was just the pressures of life taking their toll. Tanya, too, seemed to be retreating into her own world. More often than not, she spent evenings at the gym, working on her fitness, attending social events without him. Michael hadn't thought much of it. After all, she had her own life, too. But as the days passed, something inside him began to shift. The cracks were so subtle, so small, but they were there. Tanya's late nights out, the way she spoke to him with increasing indifference, the distance that had grown between them. Michael had always believed their marriage was unshakable. He had trusted Tanya implicitly, never once imagining that anything could threaten the stability of their life together. But now, that belief seemed to be slipping away, like sand through his fingers. Tanya had always been the perfect wife, the one who helped him build this perfect life. Her charm and elegance were the envy of others, the image of a woman who had it all. Yet, in the quiet of their home, Michael could feel her slipping away from him. He dismissed the feelings of unease. He was being paranoid. She was busy, and so was he. That was all. But the thought lingered, always there at the back of his mind. The coldness in her eyes, the way she avoided his touch, he couldn't ignore it anymore. As Michael sat there, surrounded by luxury, success, and the image of a perfect family, he wondered if everything was truly as it seemed. Had Tanya begun to drift away, or was he simply too absorbed in his work to notice? Could it really be possible that something was amiss? And if it was, could it be fixed before it was too late? Little did he know that this feeling of unease would soon unravel everything he thought he knew about his wife, his marriage, and his own ability to trust. Michael stood at the edge of the balcony, staring out at the horizon as the last light of day faded into the night. His fingers brushed the cool metal railing, the weight of the moment sinking in. He had always believed that Tanya was the perfect wife, the love of his life. But over the past few months, something had changed. It wasn't just the distance in her smile or the increasing coldness in her eyes. It was more than the small arguments that had begun to creep into their conversations. It was the sense that they were no longer the same 2 people they had once been. They had drifted apart, slowly and quietly, until Michael could no longer ignore it. At first, he blamed himself. Long hours at work, endless meetings, and the relentless pursuit of success had taken a toll on his marriage. He had assumed Tanya understood. After all, he was doing it all for their future. But as time went on, the tension between them grew, unnoticed by him at first, but now undeniably present. Tanya had become increasingly distant. She spent more time at the gym, socializing with friends, and Michael felt her absence more with each passing day. She had always been independent, but lately there was a coldness to her actions that made him uneasy. She no longer waited up for him, no longer greeted him with the warmth he had grown accustomed to. When he tried to talk to her, she would brush him off with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. It wasn't until he began to notice the little things, the late nights at the gym, the sudden trips to run errands, the excuses that seemed to pile up one after another, that his suspicions began to grow. Tanya had always been an open book, but now she seemed to have secrets. And the more Michael searched for answers, the more elusive they became. One evening, after another late night at work, Michael returned home to find the house empty, the silence unsettling. Tanya's car was in the driveway, but she wasn't there. He checked his phone. No messages, no calls, nothing. A sense of dread washed over him. It wasn't just the absence of her physical presence. It was the absence of her warmth, her affection. He tried to convince himself that it was nothing, just a phase, maybe. But the more he thought about it, the more it felt like something deeper, something that couldn't be ignored. That night, Michael decided to confront Tanya. He had to know the truth. He had to understand why the woman he had once shared everything with had become a stranger. But as he approached the bedroom door, a noise from downstairs caught his attention, the sound of footsteps. His heart raced as he walked quietly toward the staircase, his breath shallow. He wasn't sure why he felt so tense, so anxious. But in that moment, as he crept closer, he realized something had shifted. He stepped into the living room just as Tanya entered from the back door. She froze when she saw him. Her face, usually calm and composed, was now tense, and her eyes betrayed a hint of guilt. "Michael," she said, her voice softer than usual. "What are you doing home so early?" Michael didn't answer immediately. He stood there, his mind racing. He watched her, taking in every little detail. The way her hands trembled slightly as she held her purse. The way she avoided his gaze. "I think we need to talk," he finally said, his voice colder than he intended. Tanya looked at him, and for the first time in a long while, Michael saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. "I don't want to fight," she said quickly, her words rushed. "Please." But Michael wasn't looking for a fight. He was looking for the truth. "You've been distant lately," he said. "I don't know what's going on, Tanya, but I need to know." For a moment, there was silence. Tanya opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Finally, she dropped her gaze and took a deep breath. I don't know how to say this." The words hung in the air, heavy and thick with unspoken tension. Michael could feel the truth coming, but he wasn't prepared for what it would mean. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Tanya, please," he urged, his voice tight. "Tell me, what's going on?" Tanya's shoulders slumped, and she exhaled slowly. "I've been seeing someone else." Michael's heart stopped for a second. He couldn't move. The words were out there now, hanging in the space between them, but they didn't feel real. This couldn't be happening. Not to them. "I never meant for it to happen," Tanya continued, her voice trembling now. "But things have changed between us, Michael. I don't know how we got here, but I couldn't keep pretending everything was okay." Michael felt the ground shift beneath him. The weight of her words crushed him. He had known something was wrong, but he had never imagined this. For the first time, Michael understood what true betrayal felt like. The room seemed to close in on him. His mind raced, his emotions spinning out of control. He had trusted Tanya with everything, their love, their future, everything. And now, in the quiet of their home, it all felt like it was falling apart. "Who?" was all Michael could manage to say. Tanya hesitated. Her gaze shifted, and for a moment Michael could see the fear in her eyes. The fear of the truth coming out, of what this would mean for both of them. I'm sorry," she whispered. The next few days after Tanya's confession were a blur for Michael. He could feel the weight of her words lingering in the air, suffocating him, but every time he tried to escape it, the reality of what she had said came crashing back. "I've been seeing someone else." Her voice echoed in his mind, over and over again. He couldn't understand it. He'd trusted her with everything, his life, his love, their future. How could she betray him like this? How long had this been going on? Was it just a fling, or something deeper, something more permanent? The questions gnawed at him, but every answer he conjured seemed more painful than the last. Michael tried to keep his composure. He continued going to work, kept up appearances, but inside he was falling apart. Every glance at Tanya reminded him of the betrayal, every word she spoke seemed hollow, and every smile she flashed felt fake. She was trying to make things right, he could see that. She apologized endlessly, but it felt like too little, too late. The house, which once felt like home, now felt like a prison. Tanya's attempts to engage him in conversation were met with cold silence. Michael couldn't bring himself to look at her without feeling disgusted, hurt, and betrayed. He couldn't erase the image of her with Jared, the man who had wormed his way into their lives. How long had it been going on? How many nights had he been lying next to her while she had been with him? Tanya seemed desperate, but Michael had no idea what he was supposed to do with the pieces of their broken marriage. Her remorse was evident, but her actions, her betrayal, were beyond forgiveness. Still, she tried. She begged him to listen, to talk, to make it right. She even promised to end everything with Jared, but Michael wasn't sure if he could trust her again. Could he? Should he? His anger simmered just beneath the surface, ready to explode at any moment. The more Tanya apologized, the more he wanted to lash out. His love for her, once the foundation of his world, now felt like a distant memory. It was as if the very essence of who they were, who he thought they were, had been torn away from him. The hardest part was that he wasn't sure if he wanted to fix things anymore. Part of him wanted to move on, but another part of him longed for the woman he had fallen in love with, the woman who had stood beside him through thick and thin. One evening, after another silent dinner, Tanya reached out to touch his arm. Michael flinched, the instinct to pull away instinctive. Tanya recoiled, hurt by the rejection, but Michael couldn't bring himself to feel the same. She was a stranger to him now. The warmth he once felt when he touched her was gone. "I'm sorry, Michael," Tanya whispered, her voice breaking. "I know I've destroyed everything, but please, please don't shut me out." Michael turned his gaze to the floor, unable to look at her. Every word she spoke was like salt in an open wound. How could he trust her again? How could he forgive her for what she had done? He didn't know if he could. He didn't know if he even wanted to. "I don't know if I can, Tanya," Michael replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again." The words felt like a weight lifting off his chest, but also like an irreversible step into a future he wasn't prepared for. Tanya's face crumpled as if the world was crashing down on her. She didn't know how to fix this, how to turn back time. She was ashamed of what she'd done, but the damage had already been done. And Michael had already started to drift away, emotionally, mentally, and physically. Tanya's desperation to fix everything only made things worse. Her constant apologies, her attempts to touch him, to make amends, only reminded him of how deep the betrayal went. He didn't want to feel this way, but it was becoming impossible not to. The more Tanya begged for forgiveness, the more Michael wanted to push her away. The tension in the house was unbearable. It wasn't just the silence that hung between them. It was the unspoken truth. The fact that everything had changed, and no matter how hard they tried, they could never go back to what they once had. Michael didn't know how to process it all. Part of him wanted to scream at Tanya, to force her to understand the pain he was going through, but the other part of him, the part that had loved her for so long, was still desperately clinging to the hope that they could somehow make it work. But hope was a fragile thing, and the more Tanya tried to mend the rift, the more Michael felt it slipping away from him. Then came the night that Michael found the message. It was a text from Jared. Michael had seen it before, and each time his heart sank a little more. But this time was different. This time it was a message about plans for the future, a future that didn't involve him. The words blurred in front of Michael's eyes as he read the message over and over again, unable to process the reality of what he was seeing. Tanya had been planning to leave him. She had already made the decision, and it was only a matter of time before she acted on it. Jared had promised her the world, promised her the happiness she felt she had lost with Michael. And in that moment, everything Michael thought he knew was shattered. The betrayal was no longer just emotional. It was a plan, a deliberate choice made by Tanya. "Why didn't you just tell me?" Michael whispered, the question more for himself than for Tanya. The answer didn't matter anymore. He already knew. The silence in the house was unbearable. Michael stood in the doorway, the weight of Tanya's betrayal heavy on his shoulders. He had seen the message, the one that made it clear she had already made her choice. She had been planning to leave him. She had been preparing a life with Jared. And the worst part? She had been doing it behind his back. His pulse thudded in his ears as he turned slowly to face her. Tanya stood by the kitchen counter, her eyes fixed on the floor, unwilling or unable to meet his gaze. He could hear her shallow breathing, could feel her anxiety hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. But what could she say? What could she possibly say that would undo the damage she had done? "Tanya!" Michael's voice was low, almost a growl as he spoke her name. He had to get the words out. He had to confront her, to make her understand the depth of the betrayal. "You've been planning to leave me. I saw the message. From him. From Jared." His throat tightened with the words, each one heavier than the last. Tanya flinched. The color drained from her face, and for a moment it seemed like she might crumble under the weight of her own guilt. Her lips parted as if she were going to speak, but no sound came out. She opened her mouth again, and still nothing. It was as if the words had been stolen from her, as if she no longer had any defense against the truth. "Why didn't you tell me?" Michael's voice rose, the frustration and pain now leaking through the cracks of his controlled exterior. He took a step toward her, each one deliberate, like a predator closing in on its prey. "Why did you have to lie? Why couldn't you just be honest with me?" Tanya stepped back, her hands shaking as she clutched at the counter behind her for support. She finally looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. "I never meant to hurt you, Michael. I didn't know how to tell you. I was lost. I didn't know what to do anymore." "Lost?" Michael's eyes widened in disbelief. He felt a sharp, bitter laugh rising in his throat, but he forced it back. "You were lost, so you just decided to destroy everything we've built? You chose him over me. You chose him over us. I don't know who you are anymore." Tanya's face crumpled as the tears began to flow freely. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Michael. I never wanted it to be this way, but I was suffocating. You were never there. I felt alone." She took a step forward, but Michael stepped back, not wanting to feel her touch, not wanting her to close the distance that had already been created between them. "You think this is about me not being there?" Michael snapped, his voice shaking with anger. "This is about you choosing someone else. This is about you betraying me. And now you expect me to forgive you?" His hands clenched at his sides as the rage surged through him. "I gave you everything, Tanya. I trusted you." "I know," Tanya whispered, her voice breaking. "I know I ruined everything, but please, Michael, don't give up on me. Don't give up on us." Michael's gaze hardened. "You've already given up on us. You've already given up on me. You just didn't have the courage to face it until now." The words hit her like a physical blow. Tanya's shoulders trembled, and she looked as if she might collapse, but Michael couldn't stop himself. His chest felt tight with a mix of rage and pain. His vision blurred, not from tears, but from the overwhelming sense of betrayal that threatened to drown him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was suffocating, and every second that passed felt like a lifetime. Tanya stood there, her face pale, tears still flowing freely. But Michael couldn't bring himself to feel sorry for her. He couldn't bring himself to care. Not anymore. "Do you even realize what you've done?" Michael's voice was cold, devoid of emotion. His words were deliberate, like a knife cutting through the fog of confusion. "You've destroyed everything. You've destroyed us." Tanya stepped back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "I didn't mean to." "Save it," Michael interrupted harshly. "I don't want your excuses. I don't want your apologies. You've made your choice, Tanya, and now I have to make mine." With those words, Michael turned and walked out of the room, leaving Tanya standing there, broken and alone. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his anger still boiling beneath the surface, but he couldn't stay. Not in this house. Not with her. Not with the woman who had destroyed everything they had. Tanya remained standing in the kitchen, her shoulders shaking as she collapsed onto the floor, tears streaming down her face. But Michael didn't look back. He couldn't. The foundation of their life had crumbled, and there was no going back. The days that followed the confrontation were a blur for Michael. He barely slept, barely ate, and barely spoke. He moved through his life like a ghost, haunted by the events of the past few days. Tanya's betrayal felt like a constant weight pressing down on him, suffocating him with every breath he took. He couldn't escape it, couldn't escape her. His mind churned, unable to find any peace. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Tanya with Jared, the two of them laughing together, sharing intimate moments while he had been there, oblivious, believing everything was fine. Michael's heart burned with anger, but more than that, it ached with a deep, hollow pain. He couldn't believe it. Couldn't believe she had chosen him over their life, their family. The house, once filled with love and warmth, now felt cold and empty. The walls seemed to close in on him. Every corner reminded him of her, of their life together, of the trust he had placed in her. And now it was all gone. Tanya had tried to apologize, tried to reach out to him, but Michael couldn't even look at her without feeling disgusted. Her words meant nothing now. They were just empty promises, words she had thrown at him in an attempt to make him believe that everything could go back to how it was. But Michael knew better. He knew that the damage was irreparable. Days turned into nights, and Michael spent most of his time in his study, alone. He couldn't bring himself to face her. He couldn't bring himself to face the life they had built together. Every time he tried to move past it, his mind betrayed him, dragging him back into the nightmare. Tanya, for her part, tried desperately to mend the rift. She cried in front of him, apologized repeatedly, begged him to forgive her. But Michael couldn't forgive her. He couldn't forget what she had done. The lies, the deceit, the affair, it all twisted inside him, poisoning everything he had once believed in. He wanted to scream, wanted to lash out at her, but instead he did nothing. He withdrew into himself, isolating himself from everything and everyone. The anger, the betrayal, the hurt, it consumed him. But no matter how much he tried, he couldn't find a way out. One evening, as he sat alone in his office, the doorbell rang. He knew it was her. He could feel it. Tanya had been persistent in trying to reach him, trying to fix what she had broken, but Michael couldn't bring himself to care. He didn't want to see her, didn't want to hear any more of her apologies. He wanted to escape, but there was nowhere to go. With a deep sigh, he stood and walked to the door. He opened it, and there she was, standing in front of him, her face pale and drawn, her eyes swollen from crying. But Michael didn't feel sympathy. He didn't feel anything. "Tanya," he said coldly, his voice a mere whisper. "What do you want?" I just need to talk to you." Tanya's voice trembled, but she held herself together, at least on the outside. She had been trying so hard, trying to make things right, but Michael could see the desperation in her eyes. He could see that she knew what she had done, what they had both done, and she was terrified of losing him. "Talk?" Michael repeated. His anger flared again, but he kept his composure. "What's left to talk about? You've already made your choice. You've already destroyed everything." Tanya's lips quivered and she took a step forward. "Michael, please, I know I've hurt you, but I love you. I made a mistake. I wasn't thinking, but I—" "Stop," Michael interrupted, his voice sharp. "Don't tell me you love me. Not now. Not after everything. You had your chance, Tanya, and you chose him." The words hit her like a physical blow. She stepped back, a look of devastation crossing her face. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Michael watched her, his heart heavy, but no longer capable of feeling any sympathy. He had loved her with everything he had, but now that love was gone, replaced by the bitter taste of betrayal, "I don't know who you are anymore," he said softly, almost to himself. "The woman I married would never have done this to me. I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again." Tanya's face crumbled, and she collapsed into a chair, her hands covering her face as she sobbed. The sound of her crying filled the room, but Michael stood there unmoved. "I'm so sorry," she cried, her voice barely audible through her tears. "I never meant to hurt you. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." But it didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. Michael turned away, his back to her as he walked toward the window. He didn't want to hear her apologies, didn't want to hear her excuses. He had heard it all before, and it meant nothing now. The foundation of their marriage had crumbled, and no amount of words could rebuild it. As he stared out at the darkening sky, Michael realized that he had reached the point of no return. There was no going back from this. The damage was done. The love, the trust, the life they had built, it was all gone. Michael stared at the empty glass in his hand, the liquid sloshing slightly as his hand shook. It had been days since the confrontation, and each one had passed in a haze of anger, confusion, and betrayal. Tanya had begged for his forgiveness, pleaded for him to see past the hurt. But he couldn't. The more she apologized, the more it felt like salt in an open wound. The warmth that once filled their house, the laughter, the love, had all been replaced by cold silence. Tanya tried, yes, but every word out of her mouth only reminded him of the hollow promises she had made. He could no longer look at her without seeing the betrayal, without seeing the lies. He had tried to convince himself that maybe, just maybe, they could repair what had been broken. But deep down, he knew the truth. There was no going back. The trust they had once shared had shattered into irreparable pieces, and no matter how many times Tanya said she was sorry, no matter how many times she swore she had learned her lesson, it was too late. Michael found himself at a crossroads. The man he had been was no longer there, replaced by someone who could barely recognize the reflection in the mirror. He had always prided himself on being in control, but now he was consumed by something darker, something he couldn't control. His thoughts often drifted back to Jared, the man who had taken his wife, the man who had destroyed everything Michael had worked for. It wasn't just the affair. It was the emotional betrayal, the manipulation, the way Tanya had allowed herself to be swept away by him. Michael hadn't been blind. He knew that their marriage had been fraying for months, maybe even years. The distance between him and Tanya had grown, but he had buried himself in work, telling himself it was just a phase. But this was more than a phase. This was the breaking point. He set the glass down with a thud, the sound sharp in the silence. Tanya was upstairs, probably crying again. She had cried so much over the past few days, trying to make him see that she was sorry, that she still loved him. But Michael couldn't hear it anymore. The words meant nothing to him now. He couldn't ignore the fact that she had chosen Jared. He couldn't ignore the pain that twisted in his chest every time he thought about it. He had loved her, he had given her everything, and she had thrown it all away. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. The woman he had married, the woman he had trusted with his life, was gone. The person standing in front of him now, apologizing and begging for his forgiveness, was a stranger. Tanya had said she was lost, but Michael realized with a sickening clarity that he was lost too. He was lost in the anger, in the betrayal, in the sense that everything he thought he knew had been turned upside down. He took a deep breath and stood up, walking slowly toward the stairs. Tanya had tried to talk to him, to make things right, but the truth was he couldn't face her. He couldn't face the woman who had shattered everything they had built. The words she had said, about being sorry, about not knowing what she had done, were just words now, empty words. When he reached the top of the stairs, he paused outside their bedroom door. Tanya was lying in bed, her face buried in the pillow as she cried. The sight of her, broken and defeated, should have stirred something in him, but all it did was remind him of the countless nights he had spent alone, trusting her, believing in their future together. He opened the door, his footsteps silent on the carpet. Tanya didn't notice him at first, lost in her grief. But when she heard the door creak, she looked up, her eyes wide with surprise. "Michael," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Please don't leave me." But Michael didn't say anything. He simply stood there, staring at her, her tears, her pleading. It all felt so distant now. He had reached the point of no return. There was no coming back from this. There was no fixing what had been broken. "I don't know who you are anymore," Michael said softly, his voice barely audible. It was the truth. He didn't know who she was. The woman he had loved was gone. The trust they had shared had been shattered, and nothing could put it back together. Tanya's sobs grew louder, but Michael couldn't bring himself to care. He had tried to hold on, tried to believe in her, in them. But now, standing there in the doorway, he realized that he was done. This was the end. He turned and walked away, the sound of her crying following him as he retreated down the stairs. The door to the outside was waiting for him, and with it, freedom. The freedom to walk away, to leave it all behind. Michael didn't know what came next. He didn't know how he would live with this, how he would move forward. But one thing was certain. He couldn't stay. Not with her. Not with the woman who had torn his life apart. The night air was thick with tension, a stillness that weighed heavily on Michael as he sat in the dim light of his study. He hadn't slept in days, and his mind was spiraling, overwhelmed by the unrelenting ache of betrayal. Tanya had tried, she had apologized, pleaded for his forgiveness, but he couldn't forget. Every time he looked at her, he saw the lies, the deceit, and the broken trust. Nothing was the same. He had always prided himself on being rational, on being able to control his emotions, but now, nothing seemed to make sense. The anger that had been building inside him over the past few weeks had reached a breaking point. The constant fighting, the hollow apologies, the relentless reminder of her infidelity. It was too much. Tanya had begged him to stay, to give their marriage another chance, but Michael wasn't sure he even knew who she was anymore. The love they had once shared seemed like a distant memory, fading with each passing day. All he had left was the emptiness and the overwhelming sense of betrayal. It had been a long, exhausting day, and Michael felt like he was losing control. The house felt suffocating, each room reminding him of the life he thought he had, now destroyed. He didn't know how much more he could take. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping harshly against the floor, breaking the silence that had settled over the room. He walked to the kitchen, his mind a whirl of emotions he could no longer suppress. He needed to do something, anything, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the storm inside him was about to break. Tanya was upstairs, probably waiting for him to return to their bedroom, to make things right, to act like everything was normal. But how could he pretend? How could he continue to live in this house with this woman who had betrayed him in ways he couldn't even comprehend? He opened the fridge, grabbed a bottle of whiskey, and poured himself a drink, his hands trembling as he did. The cold liquid burned his throat as he swallowed, but it didn't numb the pain. Nothing seemed to. Michael's thoughts turned to Jared, the man who had stolen his wife, the man who had taken everything from him. His mind flashed back to the moments he had seen them together, the looks they exchanged, the intimacy they shared. The betrayal was suffocating, and now Michael couldn't help but think of what he would do to make it stop. He didn't know what he was doing. He didn't know how far he was willing to go, but the anger, the pain, the feeling of being betrayed, it was too much. He needed to confront it. He needed to face it head on. He finished his drink in one gulp, the heat spreading through his chest. His mind was clouded with rage, his heart pounding in his ears. Without thinking, he grabbed his jacket and headed upstairs, his footsteps heavy on the stairs, echoing in the silence. Tanya was sitting on their bed, her back to him, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She hadn't heard him approach. Her sobs were so quiet that it almost seemed like she was trying to hide them, trying to hold back the weight of her own guilt. But when she turned and saw him standing in the doorway, there was no mistaking the look in his eyes, the fury, the hurt, the disgust. She froze, her eyes widening in fear. She could feel it, the same sense of inevitability that had been building in him for days. "Michael, please," Tanya whispered, her voice cracking. "Please don't leave me. I'm so sorry. I know I've hurt you. But I love you. I'll do anything, please." Her words fell on deaf ears. Michael didn't hear her. All he could think about was the betrayal, the lies, the hollow promises, and for the first time he wasn't sure he cared anymore. "I don't believe you," he said softly, the words sharp like a knife. "I can't believe you." Tanya stood up quickly, reaching for him, but Michael stepped back, his body rigid with anger. His hands clenched into fists at his sides as he looked at her, his mind reeling. How could she think that she could just apologize and everything would be okay? "You think sorry is enough," Michael spat. "You think you can just say sorry and everything will be fine? You've destroyed everything. Everything I thought I knew is gone." Tanya's face crumpled, the pain in her eyes mirrored in his, but there was no way back now. The words had been said. The damage had been done. She reached for him again, but Michael stepped back, his breath coming in sharp gasps. Something inside him snapped. The anger, the pain, the overwhelming sense of betrayal. It all boiled over in that moment. He couldn't stop it. He couldn't control it anymore. Without thinking, he grabbed her, his hands wrapping around her wrists, his grip tightening with every passing second. Tanya gasped, but it wasn't fear of him that caused her to struggle. It was the shock, the realization that everything had just gone too far. "Michael, please," she begged, but the sound of her voice only made the anger inside him flare higher. The world around him seemed to close in, the walls pressing in tighter and tighter. Tanya's desperate pleas, her broken words, they didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was the pain, the rage, the overwhelming need to make everything stop. And then, in a single violent motion, Michael pushed her away, his chest heaving as the anger consumed him. Tanya stumbled back, falling to the floor, but Michael didn't care. He didn't care about anything anymore. As he stood there, panting, the silence in the room grew deafening. Tanya lay on the floor, her body trembling, the realization of what had just happened sinking in. There was no going back from this. Michael had hoped, even convinced himself, that he could somehow bury the night's actions. The rage, the physical altercation, the crash of everything they had built. It all seemed so distant the next morning, obscured by the fog of anger and alcohol. He had spent the night pacing the house, his mind spiraling further into a haze, trying to find some semblance of control, some way to reverse the chaos that had unfolded. But the damage was done. Tanya had been left in the hallway, her body trembling from shock, her words almost too soft to understand as she muttered apologies over and over again. The second he had pushed her away, something deep inside him had broken. He could see the fear in her eyes, but it didn't matter anymore. The anger, the betrayal, it eclipsed everything. After the silence settled, Michael thought about the next move. He couldn't face the consequences. He needed to hide what had happened, to pretend it hadn't. His mind raced to formulate a plan, something to make this go away, something to protect him from the inevitable fallout. He didn't know how long he stood there, his fingers gripping the back of the chair, his mind caught between his own guilt and the desire to protect himself. But soon his thoughts turned to damage control. He had to think ahead. He couldn't let anyone see the truth. With a deep breath, Michael began cleaning up. First, the broken glass, the evidence of the physical altercation. He methodically removed any traces of their fight, carefully hiding what could implicate him. He wiped down surfaces, repositioned furniture, and checked the windows. His mind was numb, his body stiff with the effort of pretending that everything was okay. Tanya had said she was sorry, but sorry didn't erase the mess. Sorry didn't take away the fact that things had gone too far. And so Michael knew what he had to do. He had to make it look like an accident, something that could be explained away. He had learned over the years to cover his tracks, to make sure his world looked unblemished on the outside. But now he was about to push it to its limits. The adrenaline pumped through him as he tried to keep his emotions in check. He grabbed his phone and made a call, his voice steady and calm, masking the chaos swirling inside. The plan was simple: create a scene that would leave no trace of what had really happened. He arranged the furniture, knocked over some items in the living room, and scattered a few things near the door. It had to look like a break-in, a random, violent robbery that had gone wrong. Nothing too obvious, just enough to make it seem plausible. Tanya had watched him quietly, not speaking, her face pale with fear and uncertainty. She was frozen, unsure of what to do next. Michael's plan relied on her silence. She had no choice. She would have to play along. If she spoke up, it would be the end for both of them. As the minutes passed, Tanya quietly agreed to cooperate, her voice barely audible. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. Michael's eyes met hers, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he saw fear in her eyes. Not the fear of him, but of the consequences of what they had both done. But he wasn't thinking about the consequences. He was thinking about getting out of this mess, of making sure he wasn't caught. "Stay quiet," he said flatly, his voice devoid of emotion. "Don't say anything. I'll take care of it." He didn't know how long it would take for the police to arrive, but he had to make sure that no one suspected anything. He had to make sure that the world believed it was just another random act of violence. As he worked, the weight of his actions pressed down on him, but his thoughts were consumed by the need to escape responsibility. His fingers were numb as he moved through the motions, setting up the scene. He called the police, giving them just enough information to make it seem like a break-in. The minutes dragged by as he anxiously waited. His stomach churned with the realization of what he had done, what he was trying to cover up. But there was no turning back now. The call had been made, and now he had to play the part. When the police finally arrived, Michael's heart was pounding in his chest. He watched as they examined the scene, carefully looking for any clues that would reveal the truth. But he had covered his tracks well. Everything appeared consistent with his story. The officers asked questions, but Michael kept his answers short, controlled. He played the concerned husband, the worried man whose life had been shattered by a random act of violence. Tanya sat beside him, barely speaking, her face pale and her eyes filled with fear. She didn't argue. She didn't speak out. She simply nodded when asked. After the investigation, the police concluded that the robbery had gone wrong, leaving Michael to breathe a sigh of relief. For now, the truth was buried. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't last. Eventually, the lies would catch up to him. They always did. As the officers left, Michael sat down on the couch, his body feeling drained. He had escaped this time, but at what cost? How long could he continue to hide the truth? How long could he keep up the facade before everything collapsed? He looked at Tanya, sitting across from him, her face a mixture of guilt and fear. He didn't know what to do with her now. She was just as trapped in this as he was, but he couldn't help but feel betrayed once more. This was no longer about their marriage. It was about survival. For the first time, Michael realized that this wasn't just a fight. It wasn't just about their broken marriage. This had gone too far, and there was no turning back. It had been days since the police investigation, but the tension in the house hadn't dissipated. Michael could feel the weight of his own decisions crushing him, yet he continued to hold it all together on the surface, doing his best to maintain the facade. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to appear. He had done everything he could to cover his tracks. The staged scene, the false narrative, the lie about the break-in, it was all so neatly tied up. Yet, despite his careful planning, something inside Michael couldn't shake the nagging feeling that it was all unraveling. Every time he closed his eyes, he was confronted by the same overwhelming guilt. Tanya, on the other hand, had remained eerily quiet. She had complied with Michael's plan, playing her part in the cover-up, but Michael could see the fear in her eyes. It wasn't just fear of the police, it was fear of him. She knew the truth, and though she had accepted her role in the lie, her conscience gnawed at her. They were trapped together in this nightmare. Tanya's once shining beauty was now overshadowed by the toll the past few days had taken on her. She no longer carried herself with the same grace she once did. The guilt, the shame, it weighed on her. But there was no turning back. Not for her, not for Michael. The phone rang, cutting through the silence in the house. Michael glanced at the screen, his heart sinking when he saw the number. It was the police. They wanted to talk again. He felt his stomach churn as he picked up the phone. The moment he answered, he could hear the tension in the voice of the detective on the other end. "Mr. McCarthy," Detective Andrews said, his voice tight with urgency. "We need to speak with you. There are a few more questions regarding the investigation." Michael's mind raced. It was happening. The cracks in the facade were becoming more apparent. The lie was starting to crumble. He could hear his pulse in his ears, the pressure building in his chest. "Of course," Michael replied, his voice steady. "I'll be there right away." He hung up the phone and turned to Tanya, his eyes dark with the realization that this was it. There was no way to escape it now. His hands clenched into fists at his sides as he watched Tanya, who had remained silent throughout the conversation. She looked back at him, her face pale, a silent understanding passing between them. "I don't know how much longer we can keep this up," Tanya said softly, breaking the silence. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it hit Michael like a cold wave. "I can't keep pretending, Michael." The word stung. She was right. The lies, the cover-up, it had all gone too far. But what choice did they have? What other option was there but to keep the story straight? "We have no choice," Michael replied, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "We have to do this, for both of us." Tanya closed her eyes, tears beginning to form, but she didn't let them fall. She nodded silently, as if accepting the harsh reality of the situation. Michael grabbed his coat, his hands trembling as he put it on. He needed to face the truth, to confront whatever would come next. But even as he left the house, the weight of what he was doing began to settle into his bones. He had buried his emotions so deep that he wasn't sure if he could find them again. He didn't know if he even wanted to. The drive to the police station was quiet, the only sound the hum of the engine as Michael tried to steady his breathing. His mind was a storm of thoughts, but one thing was clear. He had to keep the story intact. There could be no room for doubt, no room for mistakes. He would lie if he had to. He would do whatever it took to protect himself. When he arrived at the station, he was ushered into an interrogation room almost immediately. The room was stark, the walls bare except for a few sparse details. A clock on the wall, a chair, a table in the center. It felt suffocating. Detective Andrews walked in shortly after, his face hard and unreadable. He sat across from Michael, the tension between them palpable. "We've been reviewing the footage," the detective began, his tone serious, "and we've noticed some inconsistencies." Michael's heart skipped a beat. He had made sure everything was perfect. The scene, the evidence, everything was supposed to check out. But there was a hitch. There always was. "What do you mean?" Michael asked, his voice betraying none of the panic that was rising in his chest. "There's a gap in the timeline," the detective replied, "and some of the details about the break-in don't add up. We need you to come down to the station again tomorrow for further questioning. It's just a formality, but we're getting closer to piecing this together." Michael swallowed hard. He couldn't breathe. The walls were closing in, and he could feel it. His lies were starting to unravel, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "You're free to go for now," Detective Andrews added, though his words held no reassurance. "But be prepared. We'll be in touch soon." Michael left the room, the weight of the detective's words pressing down on him. The sense of impending doom was suffocating. He had only delayed the inevitable. As he walked back to the car, Michael's mind raced. The truth was inching closer, and he knew there was only so much time left before it all came crashing down. The courtroom was stark, the air heavy with the weight of the truth that was about to unfold. Michael sat at the defendant's table, his hands trembling in his lap, despite his best efforts to remain calm. The echoes of footsteps reverberated in the cold room as the judge entered, and the murmurs of the audience quieted instantly. He had never imagined it would come to this. His life, his carefully crafted world, was crumbling before him. The truth had been dragged into the open, and there was no escaping it. His past actions, the lies, the betrayal, and the violence. Everything was being laid bare in front of the eyes of the world. Tanya was not in the courtroom. She couldn't bear to face him, not after everything that had happened. Michael felt the sting of her absence, but deep down, he knew this was the consequence of his actions. The weight of her loss, her fear, her silence. He carried it all. The prosecutor, a man with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor, stood up and addressed the court. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to address a crime of passion, a tragedy that could have been avoided had one man not allowed his jealousy and rage to spiral out of control." Michael's heart sank. Every word the prosecutor spoke felt like a knife digging deeper into his chest. The courtroom was quiet, the tension thick as the prosecutor detailed the events that led to Tanya's injury, the lies Michael had told, and the cover-up that had followed. Every accusation hit Michael like a punch in the gut, and he couldn't stop the flood of memories rushing to the surface. The rage, the broken trust, the choices he had made. He remembered every moment with painful clarity. The prosecutor's voice rose, and Michael could feel every word burning into him. And now, Mr. McCarthy must face the consequences of his actions. He took the law into his own hands, and he must answer for it. Michael's eyes dropped to the table in front of him, his mind spinning. He couldn't look at anyone. His own guilt was suffocating, his chest heavy with the weight of his own shame. He had never imagined it would end like this, but the evidence was undeniable. The footage, the witness statements, his own confession, it all painted the same picture. The defense attorney, a woman with a soft voice but a sharp mind, rose to speak on Michael's behalf. She spoke of his character, his history, his devotion to his family. She painted Michael as a man who had lost his way, who had been overwhelmed by his emotions and driven to the edge by betrayal. But Michael couldn't bring himself to believe the words. They were just that, words. They didn't change the fact that he had acted out of rage, that he had crossed a line from which there would be no return. Then came the moment he had been dreading, his turn to speak. The judge turned to Michael, her eyes steady and waiting. "Mr. McCarthy, would you like to make a statement?" Michael stood, his legs shaking. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room on him, the silence pressing down on him. His throat felt dry, his voice almost a whisper as he began. He paused, trying to gather the words, but it felt impossible. His mind raced. His thoughts tumbled over one another, but he couldn't find the right thing to say. The truth was raw, jagged. It was too late for apologies, too late for explanations. "I was wrong," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I hurt the one person I promised to protect. I betrayed her trust, and I betrayed my own sense of who I was. I didn't know how to deal with what had happened. I let my emotions control me, and I hurt her." He paused again, his eyes filling with tears as the gravity of his actions began to settle in. "I can't take back what I've done. I can't undo the damage. I've lost everything that mattered to me." The courtroom was silent, and Michael's voice faltered as he spoke the words that he had never imagined he would have to say. I just want to say that I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything." The words hung in the air, thick with regret. The room seemed to close in around him, the suffocating weight of his guilt pressing on his chest. There was no way to take it back, no way to change the past. He had said the words, but he knew they didn't mean anything anymore. The damage was done. As he stepped back from the stand, he felt a sense of emptiness wash over him. There was no relief, no closure, just the cold, harsh reality that he had destroyed everything. The judge's voice broke the silence. "We will now proceed to sentencing. Mr. McCarthy, your actions will not go unpunished." Michael's heart pounded in his chest, but there was nothing he could do now. The decision had been made. The verdict was inevitable. The truth had come out, and now he would face the consequences. What do you think of Michael McCarthy's actions and the devastating consequences of his choices? Do you believe his actions were justified by the emotional pain he experienced, or was the betrayal too great to forgive? From which region are you watching this video? Let us know in the comments below. We would love to hear your thoughts and where you're tuning in from.